Good morning, everyone. It's a little nippy out there this morning, but the sunshine certainly looks good. I'm Joanne Bundy. I chair the Community Education Council, which sponsors the bucket courses. And the Planning Committee and I welcome you to the first class of the course on the Vietnam War, the war nobody won. I want to tell you this morning that if you're a new timer, you'll notice the orange sheets of paper on the table, and that will answer all of your questions. There are the announcements. You will all notice too that the very first one on the announcement sheet is to please silence your cell phone. So if you haven't done that yet, please take care of that. The Planning Committee wants to thank you, of those of you who filled out the evaluation sheet for the variety pack last week. You will be interested to know that everyone who responded wanted us to continue to do variety packs in the future. So it won't be our standard format, but every once in a while we will have a variety pack, and we hope that you will continue to enjoy that. The T-coil is working this morning, so those of you who have hearing aids that accommodate the T-coil, turn them on and let us know how it works during the break. Well, this morning is the first class of Jim Ahrens' course on the Vietnam War. Jim Ahrens is a retired lieutenant colonel of the Army, and he's also Professor Emeritus from Wentworth College, the Wentworth Military Academy College in Lexington, Missouri. We're very fortunate to have a military historian in our midst, and I am happy to present Professor Jim Ahrens.
Thank you, Joanne. Can everybody hear me okay? In the back of the room, it's not too loud, not too soft, Goldilocks just right? Okay. Well, we're going to conduct this kind of like what I did in teaching this. I taught a course in American military history, which was a requirement of the ROTC program. So I had a lot of my graduates, and many of whom I got to visit with the first weekend of October when they had homecoming down at the academy. If we look back almost 40 years, this subject still is controversial, particularly among people who are of about my age. We immediately left college or high school and were subject to the draft, and most of us were eligible for service or deferment or avoidance of both. And even now, strong feelings remain. I went to officer training and went on active duty in the Air Force for the next 11 plus years. After tech school and a year of service as a radar controller here in the United States, I was deployed to a small island radar site between Japan and China in an air defense role. And that was calendar year 1965. The year of the big commitment of U.S. forces to Southeast Asia. And we'll get into that much later. We supported the deployment, and we were extremely busy in that. I returned to the States, and then I was treated to the vitriol of a growing anti-war movement, particularly in San Francisco, where I went to join my wife. I've never forgotten that. I had no further deployments to Southeast Asia before the end of the war. But I was assigned to ROTC duty at Drake University from 1970 to 73. And that was at the height of the campus anti-war movements, including bombs in Des Moines, bombs in Madison, Wisconsin, and then the ultimate Kent State. I got to debate anti-war protesters, and we also had the additional duty of notifying of next of kin of casualties, because we were closest unit, active unit in the area. Now, I remember those days. That's the hardest thing I ever have done. So we're going to talk about Vietnam and primarily its background this morning. Joanne, if you could knock down the front row of lights here, we'll start using these slides that I have. Some of this stuff is a resurrection of my old view graph transparencies, which I used for a long time. You know, the kind you take a sheet of acetate and then write on them. Well, I've updated it now to PowerPoint, and hopefully we'll get to see this. The first thing when we started the unit on Vietnam, I would hand out a Vietnam note guide. Give somebody an idea of what to look for while I was talking and trying to organize it a bit. And you can use the same thing with the same purpose. This is the continuation page, and we're going to get into most of that stuff unless I get lost or get sidetracked in something else. And then at the end of the unit, those were the exam questions. I had part 1, 50 points. Just identify and tell the significance of those, of 25 of those. So I always gave people a little extra to rely upon. Once you did that, then I only wanted one sentence. What is it? Why is it significant? You could do it in 2 sentences, no problem. Then I gave them an exam question, and some of them I gave as handouts. So I gave it this one, and they took a chance on reading it and preparing, because the next week they were going to take that exam. And I gave them an opportunity to bring in some of the notes and outlines that they may have used. I insisted on it being in that paper so that I didn't have a whole flock of notes out on campus. I might want to use the exam again. But this will show you, and it showed me how they organized their thoughts. So we did more than one thing in that course. We always tried to teach expression and communication so that people would be able to exercise these when they finally got in the Army. And it didn't hurt for people who weren't going in the Army to take this. And once in a while I had somebody who was to come in. An occasional high school student would want to take this. And so these are some of the references that I've used. Some of them, and the first one up here, Stanley Carno, and he's just passed on in the last couple of years, is an excellent book, and it's also been made into a TV series on PBS, although it's not as good as the book, but no TV thing ever is it? And then Bernard Fall was another favorite of mine. I first got interested in the business of insurgency, counterinsurgents, and that when I was taking Homer Norton's course in contemporary history many moons ago. And I happened to read a book by a Kansas City newspaper man by the name of C.P. Snow. And it's called Red Star Over China. And from that point on, I was hooked in studying this business of insurgencies and low-intensity conflict, and sometimes it's called asymmetrical warfare, you know, the big guy against the little guy. And Fall was wonderful in his writings, and this was his last book. He stepped on a mine, and it got him and another photographer. Some more ones I've used here. And I've got these all on my shelf at home. I've got something like 2 big shelves of books on this particular subject, just because I'm curious and because there's a lot to write on. My shelf dealing with the Civil War is just about as big. The journalists like Fall was more than a journalist. He had been born in Austria, educated in the Sorbonne in France, came to the States, eventually took a PhD at Syracuse, and taught at Harvard when he wasn't out in country. And he became a reliable source, I think, anyway, for much. But there's other things. In fact, there's some courses now being offered in high schools. AP history courses, and sometimes they deal with, and they use a pretty good set of textbooks from called Major Problems in American History. And the one here by McMahon is quite good. And it's a second edition. And it's been revised a number of times to bring in more stuff as they have been produced. So we're going to look at this. And oh, you can't pass up the Pentagon Papers. And we'll get into some of the stuff out of those later on. Well, first let's look at the geography of Vietnam and Indochina. And before I get too far down the line, if you got questions, shoot. I'll try and field them as much as possible. And Joanne will wave the big question mark at me to get me to remember to repeat the question so that it'll come up onto the film as well as to your ears. But we're going to talk about this. Remember the start of Julius Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars, Roman Gallia and Tres Partes Duisit. All Gaul is divided into three parts, so is Vietnam. It is Tonkin in the north, near Hanoi in the Red River Delta, Annam in the center part, along the coast, and down south in the Saigon area, which is on the Mekong River. And you can see these on these handout maps. Because Vietnam is such a long country, an elongated S, it looks like, it's darn hard to get those to behave themselves on PowerPoint, or at least I don't have the skill with that to do that and get it into where you can see it on the screen. So you'll have to make do with these handouts that I've given you. I've got two maps on the handouts and then a timeline and facts about it that you can use for reference when you want to. If you, in the center part of it, there are two other major cities between Hanoi and Saigon, which is now called Ho Chi Minh City, is Da Nang in about the middle, and then just north of there is Hue, H-U-E, which is the old imperial capital. You can see how these things are spelled, and I'll try not to butcher up the Vietnamese name. Vietnamese is a tonal language. There's a lot of sounds that have to do with meanings of words, and I probably have a tin ear because I've never been able to do anything. Trying to speak Arabic in a later situation, I found it was rather like walking on broken glass. The country itself is about 1,200 miles long, probably maybe a little more, in the shape of that stretched out S. And it covers something like 127,000 square miles, and about 80% of that territory is covered with trees and bush. And some half of that is triple canopy jungle, which is tall trees, very tall trees, and very dark areas underneath. That leaves about 20% of the territory on which to raise rice, which is the prime crop in the area. Bernard Fall said in his Two Vietnams that in the early 60s, they produced something like 9 million tons of rice. 5 million in the south and 4 million in the north. I haven't looked up any figures about what Arkansas, for example, produces here in the States, but this is enough with these two rice bowls, one in the north, one in the south, that they produce a surplus. And when they're not killing each other and fighting over the territory and mining it and other nasty things like that, they can sell it, and did so. And of course, the French used the profits and proceeds from that. In between these two rice bowls, there's a spine of mountains that are called the Annamite Cordillera. I may have mispronounced that, but it's a string of mountains down the center line that is somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 feet, peaks. And the geography text says that the country is divided into 8 natural regions, 3 low-level plains, 3 mountain areas, and 2 in between. And in a country that is dependent upon rice cultivation in those low-lying deltas, the population concentration is amazing. In the early 60s, the average population density in the Red River Delta, that's in the north, was 1,256 persons per square mile. And one province was 3,800 per square mile. Now, compare that with the average density in the United States. We're about 60 per square mile. You know, that's the whole 9 yards all over the country. In the southern densities, they could be as little as 5 square miles, particularly in the mountains. In the southern Mekong Delta, the average was 1,380 people per square mile. Now, in 1962, when Fall was writing, 30.5 million was Vietnam's population. 29 million lived on 20% of the territory. Compare, for example, the US. In the same years, our total population was approximately 183 million, and they had had a fresh census in 1960. Using the same formula, 175 million would live between the East Coast and the Appalachians. And 8 million would live in all the rest of the country, all the way to the Pacific. So people in that neck of the woods are standing on top of each other. The Indo-Chinese people, well, the Vietnamese are pretty much the same. Originally, the natives were rather like the people in New Guinea today, but those folks have been pushed into the mountain areas by Thai and Mongol and Indian, that's East Asian India. And the Indians settled into the Khmer Empire, which is remainder today is in Cambodia, which is sometimes called the Khmer Republic. And the language of Vietnamese is loaded with Indonesian and Mongolian characteristics. Now, there was a Bronze Age culture flourishing in the 1st century BCE. And in the south primarily, a new Stone Age culture was in the north, when the Chinese imperial expansion came. Now, if you know anything about history, you've probably heard of the Qin dynasty, and it was the first to rule a united China for a short time. But the original dynamic leader of it died off early, and the place broke down into disrepair. And there was a strong man in the south who formed his own state called Nam Viet, which included people in the area now known as North Vietnam. That's the area around Hanoi, primarily. This was conquered in 111 BCE, became part of the Han Empire. And this brought Chinese culture into the picture. And the Chinese busily set forward in integrating the population into their culture and politically into the empire. Chinese administrators, and every one of them was a Confucian scholar. Now, I might remark that it was fortuitous that J.R. talked about Confucianism last week, and this carries over into what we're talking about here. The Chinese became part of the political life and life in general in the Vietnamese area. Confucian ideology was official. So were Chinese ideographs, in other words, Chinese writing, became the written form for Vietnamese. Chinese art, architecture, music, all had a powerful effect on the Vietnamese. And the invasion and occupation of that area for the next 1,000 years impacted everybody very strongly. Intermarriages and various local people produced a strain of Vietnamese that's quite different. And the locals were pushed back into the mountains and the backcountry if they wanted to retain their original culture. Blends of Thai, Hmong, and Mao dominate the North Mountain regions. A fair number of those folks that are living in parts of the United States as a result of the migrations that took place in the World War. In the South, there were also Khmer and Chinese minorities, amounting to about 15% of Vietnamese population were these minorities in 1962. The mountain dwellers eke out their own existence out in the fiercely independent wilds of the plains, or excuse me, of the mountains. They're called montagnards today. The GIs, of course, abbreviated that to yards. Another geographic characteristic of Vietnam is that there's an unequal distribution of mineral and agricultural wealth. Climate, climate and geology, I have my idioms mixed up, make the two parts of this country complementary, because the north has mineral wealth, plenty. They got coal, and they've got ferrous metals, and it's economical to mine these things. And it's quite enough to satisfy their industrial needs. And the south has plenty of agricultural production, notably rice, to handle its needs, and plenty more to sell for cash. But since 1954, with the Great Partition that took place as the settlement of the French period of the 30 Years' War, they had to divert their resources to compensate for this thing. And they ended up with close to 1 million refugees going back and forth between the two countries, and the subsequent one that took place after the 1971 conquest of the South by the North, more dislocations took place, and as a result, things were very much unsettled. Well, that's only been almost 40 years ago. Things are beginning to settle down over there somewhat, they say. Well, characteristic of the Vietnamese, the revolts have always taken place, and they've always resisted this outside domination. And the most famous early revolt took place in 39 of the current era, led by the Trung sisters. You may hear of those sometime. They're highly revered in Vietnamese history. And they were successful enough to set up an independent state, which took place in 939 as a result of Chinese disorder and it settled in for a 200-year dynasty known as the Li, L-Y. Now, most of these Chinese institutions were retained that they'd already had, and the political foundations remained Confucian. And the Chinese civil service exam remained the means of selecting officials. And the educational system continued to maintain the system of Chinese studying the Confucian classics to pass along Confucian values to people who run the state in a very paternalistic manner. And those people studying for those exams also reflected Vietnamese values as well. And village level values were predominantly the mores of the people who had always been there and done always the same thing. I saw a figure once that said that the majority of Vietnamese probably never got more than 25 miles, if that much, from where they were born. And I think we could probably find people in the American South that have that same characteristic. But there were upper income folks who lived in those villages, and they were well respected and valued, and they were a part of the village life until the 20th century came along, and urbanization took more of those people away, split the society somewhat, the upper from the lower classes, the upper moving to the urban areas in a number of cases. And that seemed to have had played a part anyway in getting people more hostile to one another. But rice was still the principal endeavor, even though there was a feudal land system. But middle-class landowners were quite profitous, and manufacturing and commerce thrived. But the Vietnam of that era never became a mainly commercial nation. And what I'm beginning to see now, excuse me, is that Vietnamese products are now getting out into markets. And I find I bought a jacket to use on my bicycle. It's a rain jacket, and you find out, made in Vietnam. And there are other things that you will find on closets that were made there. And so things are picking up. I even looked at the Vietnamese website, and they're talking about and putting into contract phase a building of a 200-mile-an-hour railroad line from Hanoi to Saigon, or to Ho Chi Minh City. So things are changing, as they always do. But first under the Li and then the Tran, prosperity remained. By the 15th century, Vietnamese dynasties were expanding to the south, defeating the Ching and the Khmer. And by the 17th century, that's the 1600s, they have occupied the Mekong River Delta. Periodically, the Chinese kept on expanding. The Vietnamese were ultimately unsuccessful in fighting them off entirely. But they did so pretty successfully for 1,000 years altogether. And then by the late 18th century, in the 19th century, Jia Long had established a new dynasty with a stable government, and they were beginning to push back against French Catholic interests. Now, excuse me, the French have just like the Portuguese did in China and Japan, they have pushed into these countries, converting people to Catholicism. They're very successful in Southeast Asia, primarily in the Vietnamese area. They were less successful in the Japanese. The Japanese took a more direct approach to keep the priests out and from gaining influence, they simply barred them. And the Tokugawa shogunate around 1600. And Tokugawas brought themselves in to a closed society. But here in Vietnam, the French began to push back. And the interests that were there coming in and investing in Vietnam were exploiting and had interest in exploiting the colonial colonies. And they persuaded Napoleon III, who was the French emperor approximately the time of the American Civil War, to send a naval expedition, and they began to force a French protectorate on the Vietnamese. Then the result of it, of course, was they started first in the south. And the French proceeded the Mekong River Delta and the territory that became known as Cochin China. And in the 1880s, the French forced their way into the rest of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And all of these were ruled until 1954 or attempted to be ruled by the French until that time. And colonialism brought little to improve the lot of the average Vietnamese. The upper classes got better education and opportunities, but the peasants and the workers got little. The nationalist opposition and the rebellions were unsuccessful all through the World War II period. And along comes the Japanese in 1940. And you all remember, I think, from the bucket course that Ken Christensen taught ably a few years ago, that France was conquered, that it was divided up by the Germans. They didn't occupy the whole country. They simply let the French form a new government at Vichy and cooperate with the Germans and their Japanese allies. And the Japanese moved in. As a matter of fact, that was one of the reasons why ultimately the Americans began to resist the Japanese in the Pacific by embargoing their oil shipments. And that's when decisions were made in Japan about putting in hand a plan to attack Pearl Harbor. The French did what the Germans ordered them to do, and they administered their colonies under the influence of the Japanese allies. And it led to a nationalist movement to fight both the French and the Japanese, but none of it was really very successful. And the Japanese continued to exploit the natural resources and the rice, of course. And as long as they were quite capable of getting those products back to Japan, because during the Central Pacific campaigns of World War II, the American submarine service did a number on Japanese shipping. And it began to get very tight in bringing those products back to the Japanese. The Allies had some activity in Indochina, principally the rescue of downed American and British airmen. And it was a fairly minor affair, but there were some people here. Let's see. I'm going to start the next section after we take the break. I'm going to shave about 3 minutes off here. Let us get to there, and then I'll take up with Ho Chi Minh, who's a rather an interesting character.
Thank you for taking your seats. Conversations are hard to end, and the cookies are hard to leave, aren't they? All right, we'll do the second half of our first class, Jim Ahrens and the Vietnam War, the war nobody won.
Hello, hello, Ted.
No.
Okay. Takes a minute or so to warm up, I guess. Kind of like me in the mornings. Well, we're going to talk about Ho Chi Minh now for a while. In the years before World War II, a nationalist movement grew up around a man known as Ho Chi Minh. And we need to learn something about him. His most commonly used name, of course, was He Who Shines. And it was a political thing. Everybody who's a revolutionary seems to have their own name, like Yosef Vissarionovich Dugashvili was really Joe Stalin, and that kind of thing. Trotsky was Lev Davidovich Bronstein before he got revolutionized, and Lenin had the same thing. So it's in the tradition. But he was born Nguyen San Chung, or Kung probably, in 1890 in Annam, which is in, if you can see on your map there, about halfway up between Hue and Hanoi in that eastern coastal zone is about where he was brought up. He was the son of a minor official, and he will be also known as several other things. Win Tat Van, Win That Than, Win I Quoc, which he had that name for quite a long time. It means Win the Patriot. And I'm sure he had a bunch of other pseudonyms that he used on various occasions where he wanted to hide his identity. He was educated in French schools. He grew up among revolutionaries, and his activities got him into a jam with the Sûreté, the French Secret Service. So he took it on a lam. He went to sea as a cabin boy in 1911. And he worked on all kinds of ships. First trip was to France itself, I must say, and then he hooked up with other French ships and traveled widely. There's all kinds of controversy or minor controversy about what he was trained to do. Some people say he was an accomplished pastry chef, and all kinds of things. I suspect that he probably did whatever he could do to eke out an existence and get along. But he lived in many places, roamed the world, and ended up for France, in Paris, in London, Harlem, to name a few other places that he got around to. So he was well-traveled. And it probably affected him one way or another, particularly in his revolutionary aspirations. We know he went to the Versailles Conference in 1919, along with a whole bunch of other people representing nationalist minority groups from Eastern Europe, from Asia, from colonies of the great powers, like former residents of Germany's colonies. They all got forfeited after World War I was over. And there were a whole bunch of people wanting their own independence in the underdeveloped world. I'd suggest that Ho was probably a nationalist first and a revolutionary, a communist second. This doesn't mean that he didn't take Marxism, Leninism seriously. He was a member of the Comintern, the Third International. He was a founding member of the French Communist Party and also the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. He studied Marxism and Leninism in Moscow in the 20s and in the 30s, and incidentally spent time in exile and various jails in places like Hong Kong and China. But when the Japanese invaded Indochina in 1940, he said, hot dog. And he stole back into Vietnam and founded and led the group called Viet Minh and provided leadership very successfully with that. And throughout the Japanese occupation, he was able to enlist, or tried to enlist the Allies to help them achieve their independence, which they devotedly sought. And the Viet Minh aided American servicemen and Allied pilots that had been forced down. And they were hoping all the while to gain the support of FDR in their cause. Now, Franklin Roosevelt was pretty lukewarm about the French coming back in and taking over their former colony. But he kept hands off of them. And the Free French were allies. And de Gaulle was, of course, representing them. But he had doubts about giving the French back part of their empire. And the Viet Minh didn't discourage those doubts. The Viet Minh worked with the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the American CIA, doing all kinds of cloak and dagger, spooky type stuff behind enemy lines. And they worked at training the anti-Japanese forces there in Southeast Asia, and did what they could until the Japanese surrendered. There was an OSS operative by the name of Archimedes Paty, who made contact with Ho and acted as sort of a conduit through the CIA to the OSS to America. But there was no help forthcoming. And then we have to go back and review something about what I covered during the years of the Korean War and its buildup, because it's highly germane to this whole study. The post-war breakdown of the alliance was as the Allies became more pronounced in their opposition to one another. Stalin was extremely paranoid. I think that's the best way to describe him. He was suspicious of anybody and anything that would possibly threaten Soviet Russia. Because after all, the Russians had been beat over the head twice in one generation. And the Germans had taken them to task, and they were found wanting in defending themselves. And now, when they had finally, with all of the aid of Lend-Lease and the things that we had done to help them, were given a pretty clear mandate to get into and stay in Eastern Europe. Churchill, of course, objected strongly to this. And Churchill was a big stumbling block in terms of what Stalin's ambitions might be. Now, were the Russians, in fact, going to conquer the rest of the world? Were they going to lead revolution across the world and the industrial world and become a guiding light for future communist success in the world? I think probably not. I think Stalin didn't have those ambitions to that degree that he's sometimes given credit for. And certainly not to the degree that the Communist International, now called the Cominform, or Communist Information Bureau, to propagandize the whole world and breed revolution out in the world, that he was able to have much more influence on the feelings of people in the West than he would have been able to otherwise. But I don't think his ambitions were that strong. He was mostly interested in defending it, because unless I'm mistaken, he never left Russia until he went to Tehran to meet with Roosevelt and Churchill. The post-war breakdown of this alliance came over such things as the guerrilla resistance in Greece, waging an insurgency against the more liberal aspects of Greek society. And the British simply couldn't do anything about it. They were flat broke. And the more democratic elements in Greece were suffering from this insurgency. They eventually withdrew. Turkey was getting similar pressure from insurgent groups, particularly in their northern and eastern provinces. The Balkans had already been taken over by the Soviets, who occupied the place, and the Yugoslav insurgents were strong in that area, embodying Serbia and Montenegro and Bosnia and Herzegovina and all of those countries in that Balkan area were under threat. And the State Department and others that were concerned with the Red Menace saw that a stand had to be made. And Truman announced, and he was never one to back away from a decision, he announced that the, quote, U.S. would support free peoples resisting armed subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. And he did that in March of 1947. And in January of that year, the British and American zones were combined over the protests of the Soviets. June of that year, the Marshall Plan was announced. And it ultimately will distribute something like $12 billion and was open to everyone in Europe that needed assistance. And the Russians had access, or could have had access to it, if they had wanted to admit what they needed. But that would not fit Stalin's view of secrecy. And so they stayed out of it. Eventually, cooperation engendered by the administration of the Marshall Plan would lead to the European Economic Community. And it's been under various names, including the Common Market, and eventually evolved into the European Union that we see now. But events in 1948 got worse. That was Truman's election year. And it was a monumental one in international relations, and particularly in Europe. There wasn't a lot going on over in the Far East, although some people will probably remember some of that. I've heard stories that Susan McIntyre was talking about in that area in that time. In February, the communists took over Czechoslovakia. In June, the Western European powers began moves towards reconstituting Germany. And on the 24th of June, the Berlin blockade began. And the Soviets cut off land and river access to Berlin to force the US and the UK to evacuate Berlin. And the French, they were also there. They also were not able to participate in the airlift that came along. But the British were. The Americans and the British marshaled whatever air transport they could find and took it to Europe and flew over 3 routes, 3 corridors into Berlin, and for about a year they supplied the city of all its needs. And it's a fairly famous incident that occurred in history. Truman sent a wing of nuclear-equipped bombers to the UK. But there's only about 450 nukes in the inventory for them to use, and they were all laboratory built. There was no factory production of nuclear bombs. And so they had a long way to go to build an arsenal if they were going to have a nuclear war at that time. don't think anybody really took that as a serious threat. But the Defense Department now existed. It was authorized in 1947, which was going to unify the four services under a new office, the Secretary of Defense. The Air Force will get to be independent. There will be 3 service secretaries and 3 service chiefs of staff with a separate joint chairman. Marine Corps would remain subservient to the Navy. Sometimes that's been a kind of a hostile relationship, but they've gotten along. The act formed the unified commands, which would be responsible for defense in the various parts of the world that they were responsible for. And they also created the specified commands, like Strategic Air Command for deterrence with nuclear, and the Transportation Command for sea and airlift. So the whole thing was being put together. And they also, in that same act, authorized the National Security Council to coordinate policy, and we've heard all about them on occasion. It was made up of whatever agencies the president wanted to work with, as well as the regulars of the DOD, the state departments, CIA, JCS. But initially, the law was very weak and didn't have much effect on the inter-service rivalries. In fact, the first Secretary of Defense was so frustrated, he committed suicide.
Oh.
It was James Forrestal. The next Secretary of Defense was a guy by the name of Lewis Johnson, and Truman appointed him because he was committed to cut defense spending and curb wasteful spending on big, expensive weapons systems. And, you know, as the saying goes, the rest is history. It's been interesting to observe this, but I think it's necessary to go back and review some of this stuff to put our fingers on what was going on when the lines were being drawn that were eventually to be used as justification for going into Southeast Asia as well. Well, 1949 was another big year of events. This led to the foundation of NATO as a result of the cooperation, the Allied cooperation and need established for that defense establishment in result of the Berlin airlift. And Germany, of course, was then stood up with the Constitution, became part of the collective defense system. And Russia had their display of power. They exploded a nuclear weapon. So all of those scientists or people who had spied out what was going on had now been successful in producing an A-bomb. And it raised to a wholly new level the Cold War. And the Americans still regarded NATO as a focus of European threat from the Soviet Union. But in '49 also, Mao triumphed in China. The Chinese communists burst out of Yunnan province and rolled up the corrupt nationalist government like a rug. And they ended up, most of them survivors, on the island of Formosa, or Taiwan, as it's more commonly called today. The People's Liberation Army had proved its proficiency with limited resources. And I'm going to get into that when I talk next week about insurgency and counterinsurgency and where this doctrine came from. But we'll get at that in due time. The response to all of these things came in what was called the containment policy, or the concept of containment, which was originated by George F. Kennan in about 8,000 words that he sent from the embassy in Moscow. Kennan was a long-time player in international affairs. He had been one of the earliest members of the American delegation to the Soviet Union when we finally recognized them and exchanged diplomats in the 1930s. And Kennan, later in life, became the originator of this containment policy. And he also taught for years at Harvard and was a contributor to many magazine and journal articles over the years, particularly in foreign affairs. Essentially, the strategy of containment embodies the idea that the communist countries had to keep expanding or they would collapse from their internal disruptions. Communism, according to Kennan, was essentially flawed because it didn't allow man the freedom to choose or change his circumstances, both economic and social. And so when Kennan analyzed the Soviet Union, he found that that was its fatal flaw, and this is why the communist government had to keep people involved by motivating them to support the world Marxian revolution. In other words, playing on mass paranoia as a means of dealing with the threat from the outside and from the capitalists. The communists had to motivate people to expand, to take over more resources, and not motivate them by economic rewards, as we get into this. One of the big things, of course, was plentiful food and consumer goods. And talking to anybody who was in the Soviet Union in the years after the Cold War started and throughout that time, there was a definite lack of consumer goods. I remember talking with an attaché at one time who said that he was begged by all manner of people to sell them at even inflated prices, American-made blue jeans. It was a big thing. And to me, blue jeans are something you wear when you're working, but it became a big thing in the Soviet Union. In other words, they had to prevent the Soviet communist bloc from expanding, and when that would be frustrated, the internal contradictions would cause it to change its system. And the classic analogy that's sometimes made of this is what happens to a Swiss steak in a pressure cooker. Now, if you like Swiss steak, which I do, you take this piece of cheap meat that's rather on the tough side and a bit stringy, and brown it and throw it into the pressure cooker along with some chopped up carrots and some tomatoes, and slap the lid on it and let her cook. And if you don't take off that little thing that holds the pressure on, you'll get a very tender dinner in the future. And that's exactly what Kennan envisioned to happen with the Soviet Union. The pressure cooker of containment. Now you say, what would that do? Well, how would you implement that? Well, it made quite an interesting strategic challenge. And the Americans responded with this, and NATO responded with this. Well, in NATO's territory, we've got all of these countries that are allied in Europe. Then they have to go and make sure that they can sew up allies and alliances in the soft underbelly of Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, and around the whole thing to bottle up the Soviet Union's expansionist ideas. Well, it became the foreign policy of the United States after 1947. And I would suggest that it came to fruition essentially in 1991, where Kennan was proven right. It was helped along with, and I'm not sure whether it was intentionally done or not, or whether it was accidental, by Ronald Reagan and his expansion of American military capabilities. But some people give him credit for that. But in any case, the containment policy became our policy, and the goal was completed. And it does nothing more, I think, than tell us that it's a very convoluted and complicated situation in foreign policy. It goes on for about 40-odd years. And this led to the domino theory. The domino theory is graphically illustrated on the backside of this one. And it says basically that through this big system of alliances, and there's a whole flock of them that you can study and how they were implemented, we would bottle up from Japan on around China, Indochina, Burma, India, and so forth. And that became part of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO. And then there was another set of alliances across the Middle East. And all of these things had to work. And if, in, for example, Southeast Asia and the SEATO Treaty, if those alliances were to break up, then one by one, starting with Vietnam, would go Thailand and Burma and India, and there's always been some things. We had the defense of Korea, which we talked about a year or so ago, and the Chinese had taken over Tibet, which is it. I'm talking with somebody the other day who said that his son had managed to get into the almost forbidden territory of Tibet, and was currently looking around. I can't remember who it was I was talking to about that. But it's beginning to open up. More light's coming in. But did it happen? Did the domino theory actually work out? We justified a massive influence of American power into Southeast Asia by the fact that people said the domino theory will cause these to go down the tubes into the next ambitious dictator who was coming along in China or in Russia. Well, we're going to see how some of this worked out in terms of the justifications that were made for it. We're going to do that in the third instance. I mentioned there the beginnings of McCarthyism because it was an anti-communist witch hunt in the United States led by a man from Wisconsin who had enormous political ambitions, and it was an outgrowth of the Cold War. But even though nobody in power in the U.S. government at that time advocated getting into a prolonged land war, they did not dare politically to resist it because they would be accused of being a communist sympathizer, a traitor, and a person who was looking after the interests of Stalin and the Communist Party. And it got to be a monumental problem. We probably all can remember and relate to all of this stuff where people were being blacklisted from Hollywood movie studios and stuff like that. It finally came out when General Eisenhower, being elected as president, put his foot down. And he managed to rein in McCarthy. But it made for a very tricky situation, though, in Washington and for people trying to navigate their way through these problems. Well, before we get any further, I want to open it up for questions and comments. this is where it should get interesting. Don't be bashful. Yes,
During the Vietnam War, over the radio, I remember a man who said he knew Ho Chi Minh, and at the end of World War I, he said Ho Chi Minh was so taken by the idea of these small countries having their own independence, and in France, he had a top hat like Wilson, and went to talk to the U.S., but they'd have nothing to do with him. But he went to Ho Chi Minh, and then went to the communists, and they took him in.
yes.
You remember hearing of anything like that?
Well, the comment he's making is that Ho Chi Minh had gone, as I said, to the Versailles Conference, where they were dickering between the great powers as to what was going to happen to reorganize Europe. And that Ho Chi Minh never has gotten much credit for it. Well, he's gotten some credit for it, because there are a few biographies out. There's one called it was translated anyway by a fellow named Duiker on Ho. It is fairly well regarded, but there's so many holes in Ho's life that it's hard to get a picture of him and everything. But he received little or no attention by anybody who was covering that area, except for the French Communist Party, who he was one of the founders of. And those people tried to make as much of a case for the colonies that were up for grabs now, essentially. The League of Nations, which was the thing that Woodrow Wilson had to get in terms of his ambitions as a means of preventing future wars into existence. And he had to trade off a lot of different things to do that. And part of it was, don't offend the other big three, Britain, France, and the U.S. and Italy. So Wilson was walking a very tight rope to get anything done. I think perhaps that might be one of the reasons why this movement for independence of the national groups got little or no attention. Eric?
Ho has always struck me as someone who had a remarkable sense of military strategy. And yet, nothing in the bio there suggests that he was a military man. Was he like a Lincoln who just had a sense of it, or was there something in his bio that suggested he has military training?
I can take the easy out by saying, Eric was asking, did Ho have any kind of military training, or was he like Lincoln, who dealt with mostly the aspects of the military that came along in the course of war and conflict? In fact, I don't think there was a West Point graduate in any of those folks in Vietnam. My best guess is, from looking at his biographies and the biographies of some other ones, that he was self-trained, that he learned it the hard way, that he made his mistakes and then adapted from there. And to me, it's an admirable characteristic for someone to recognize where you screw up and where you're successful, and go from there and find a middle road somewhere between those. George?
Jim, maybe you could, I know this is getting ahead of the game, but I noticed in The Economist that there was a notice of General Gap's death at age 102, and the relationship between Gap and Ho that might be, I don't know, is that part of the answer to the question, that they were very close?
I think that has a lot to do with it. George was commenting that General Giap has died, and it's been, and within the last 3 weeks that's happened. And that that might be one of the answers to the success of Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh and the National Liberation Front, etc. And I tend to agree with that. Giap was self-educated as well, but he was a magnificent admirer of Napoleon, and he seemed to work at it himself as being a very adroit learner in military affairs. Certainly, what he did in the Dien Bien Phu affair was quite something. We'll get to that third. Yeah, Shane?
Does the American attitude, if not policy, of isolationism explain or at least address the issues of why the United States did not respond to the Japanese invasion of Vietnam, and why it was not seen as strategically important to do that?
Okay, Shane's question is, what was the significance to America of the Japanese invasion of Indochina and their occupation, of course, in terms of taking away French territory there? It's a complicated situation in that era between the war. Roosevelt did, in fact, take some actions. He, in fact, encouraged an embargo on oil in the latter part of 1940, well, the middle to the latter part of 1941. And he, I think, had people thinking that maybe that's what caused the Japanese to attack America at Pearl Harbor and future. They didn't take any much action because we didn't have the capability of taking much of any action at all. We had 4 carriers out in the Pacific at that time, and they were just lucky they weren't in Pearl Harbor when the attack went down. And we would have been hard pressed to get anything done, I think, until we were able to mobilize the country. And here you touching on the age-old concept of American isolation, and the fact that we just as soon let everybody go to hell outside of the area between the 2 oceans during the 1930s. And that was the policy that was followed at that time. Jim?
Do you think because of the U.S. relative success in Europe and in Japan, that there was a feeling that we should intervene in Korea and Vietnam and Asia generally? That we were virtually self-appointed?
The policemen of the world?
Yeah.
Okay, Jim's comment or question is, did the fact that we did not intervene or do anything in World War II breakout time to stop Hitler or Japan, that's related to our eventual commitment to the Far East? I think there's no question about it. I think that has an enormous effect on American foreign policy from that time on, and I would think you could make a case saying that, yeah, it's still in effect today. George?
During the French colonial era, what was the relationship between France and what is now Laos and Cambodia?
They were French, the relationship in Indochina between Laos, Cambodia, and the French masters. Well, I think the big problem there was that the French were exploiting every possible resource that they could get out of it. It was money, that was driving the train in that. I think the French were extremely exploitive. And that produced a huge reaction among the individual nationalists in Indochina. The Chinese Communist Party was founded with members and delegates from all three of those countries in it, and they all had about the same goal in mind, and that was get rid of the French. Joanne? Okay, one more question, she says. Okay, well, we've nattered on long enough here.
Thank you, Jim. I don't know about you, but I have a hankering for Swiss steak. Thank you for coming this morning. Next week, we will be doing the second class of Jim's course on Vietnam. And as you can see, you need to get here early so you get a good seat next week. Now you can turn on your cell phones again and go out and enjoy this beautiful day. Thank you for coming.